This is a recording of a presentation on Native Americans and Quakers in History, originally given at the Madison Friends Meeting Gathering Forum on March 8th, 2026. Let me start by introducing myself in the Ojibwe language, the formal protocol and the way I have been taught. Anin and Dinawe Meganiduk. Greetings, my relatives. By my relatives here, I mean not only my blood relatives, but also all human beings, including all of you here today. But beyond that, I also mean the other than human relatives, the animals, the plants, and even the rocks and soils and waters and air, all of the earth and the sun and the moon and all of the cosmos. This is what I mean by Indinaway Maganiduk, my relatives. Scott Fulton Indigenakas. My name is Scott Fulton. Gawin Nindudu de Masi. I do not have a clan. To an indigenous person, this would signify that I do not have any ancestors who are native to Turtle Island or North America. Wisconsin Nindunjaba. Ganiogamag Ninda. I am from Wisconsin and live in the place of four lakes. This is a place that the Ho-Chunk people who lived here since time immemorial called Tejope, which also means four lakes. And of course, we know this as the greater Madison area. Midashnibing Gamiskwawakokag Gichiminasing Ninda. But in the summertime, I live in a place called Star Island in Cass Lake, Minnesota, where my family has had a summer cabin for the last 80 years. I bring this up because I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about where my interest in and leading around Native Americans actually comes from. This place, Star Island, is actually, as you could imagine, very, very special to me and my family. But it's also located in a place called Gazagasquajimekag, which is in English known as the Reservation of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. So, from a very, very early age, Native American people were not something from the distant past, but were a very real present thing to me. And I was always did not know a lot about them, but I always had a sense that they were there, and always wondered about the history of what this place was in the past and how it is that we came to have a cabin there. So you could say that my interest in indigenous people began in my childhood. The next stage in my journey toward this leading around indigenous people started about 25 or so years ago when I first moved out to the Madison area. And I became really intrigued by this kind of mosaic of prairies, oak savannas, oak woodlands, and wetland areas that existed in this part of the world prior to European settlement. And as you learn about these, one of the really intriguing things is that these are all what are called fire dependent ecosystems. They require frequent burning in order to be stable. And part of the result of that is that they're amazingly biodiverse. These are actually some of the most diverse, biologically diverse ecosystems on the entire planet. And I've gotten very, very involved in this, as a lot of you, I think, are aware. I do a lot of prescribed burning, particularly with a organization called the Prairie Enthusiasts. And I think over the last 25 years, I've maybe done about 300 or so prescribed burns. But as I've learned more and more about fire ecology and the history of these, natural history of these landscapes, um, one of the things that I just found absolutely fascinating was that the fire, the source of the fire that maintained these landscapes were the indigenous people that were living here. Um, The amount of fire that was required and the scale of this is really kind of astonishing. Over the eastern two-thirds of the country and most of California, um, fires were occurring typically every 5 to 10 years or so, on a lot of this landscape. And that amount of fire, that frequency of fire, cannot possibly be caused by lightning. This had to be caused by the people that were living there. And this was done quite deliberately. This was done as a way to manage the land in a way that made it favorable to live on, basically. And there's been a lot of research that has backed this up, both historical research. The indigenous people themselves have a lot of stories and knowledge about this. Um, but also, recently, there's been a lot of interesting work that I've been very fascinated by looking at tree ring data. When you do a burn in a forested area, it will frequently scar the bark of the tree. The tree will still live, at least if it's tolerant of fire, but it'll leave a scar in the tree rings. So this is a section of a red pine stump that was taken near our cabin up on Star Island in Minnesota. And it's recording on these fires set by the Ojibwe people starting in 1747 and continuing every 10 years or so until right around 1900 when the Ojibwe left the island. So this kind of brought this very much home to me. And one of the things about realizing the relationship between fire, people, and the ecological system is that people are actually part of these natural communities. We're not really separate from it. And this whole thing about fire and indigenous people really brings that home. The last part of forming this connection and really igniting this leading for me was during the summer of 2020 and into 2021, during the protests for the killing of George Floyd. Um, there are a lot of reactions to this, and a lot of things I experienced personally, but a major turning point for me was early in 2021. The meeting had a multi-part workshop run by some amazing outside facilitators, looking at systemic racism and what it takes to be a really good ally. And I realized in going through that workshop, which had a profound effect on a lot of people in the meeting, I believe, and it certainly did on me, but the effect on me was maybe a little different. It awoke in me this sense of connection with the systemic racism that the indigenous people in North America suffered, which was different from that of African Americans and other groups. And that was really the turning point for me when I realized that this was starting to become a leading, and I began to kind of inhale books and webinars and other things on this particular subject. So, with all of that leading me on, I decided in the fall of 2021 to take a major step and enroll as an elder student at Leech Lake Tribal College. For those of you who may not be familiar with tribal colleges and universities, there are about 35 of them in the country in the United States. And these serve a function, first of all, kind of like a lot of other community colleges. They all have very strong career training, vocational training programs. Leech Lake has a particularly strong one in residential construction, but because that's a big need up there. But a lot of other kinds of programs like that. They're also a good starting point for people of a lot of different ages and situations in life to begin or continue a journey in higher education. So those are kind of like traditional community colleges, but Um, the tribal colleges also have an extremely important role in that they also serve as a repository of language and culture for the tribes that create them. Um, and this is a extremely, extremely important thing, and particularly the language part of it. So I kind of took advantage of the fact that COVID was still going on, and they were teaching most of their courses online. It's a little difficult to get up for classes in northern Minnesota when you live in Wisconsin. So I took some Ojibwe language classes and history, and some other classes. The highlight, however, was a semester-long course on Manoomin, or wild rice, which is very, very central to the culture of the many of the tribes around the Great Lakes, and particularly the Ojibwe. And so we learned all about the biology and history and culture of wild rice, but also spent a week out on the lakes actually ricing. And that's me standing in the back of a canoe with an 18-foot long cedar pole. That's kind of how you do it in the traditional way. And we did some of the rice processing, and it was just an amazing, amazing experience, and way outside of my comfort zone, and really was that way for I think most of the students. They knew about this, but this is not something that they had a real chance to practice, generally speaking, and they were very, very excited to be able to take this back to their families and continue this tradition that has been going on for millennia. So, in the beginning of 2024, I was approached by our clerk, Kay Stevens, um, because the meeting was about to adopt a formal land acknowledgement minute. We did adopt that in April of 2024, and I had not been involved at all in the creation of this, but I was very, very pleased with how the minute turned out, and very strongly supportive. One of the things that's really nice about this, I think any good land acknowledgement minute will have, is not just the acknowledgement part of it, which could become quite performative, but to actually set some goals for our community for how we're going to respond to that acknowledgement. And this one has some pretty ambitious goals. And so Kay asked me, because of my strong interest in this subject, to if I would consider taking on a bit of a leadership role in helping the meeting actually undertake some of these actions. And so the reason we're having this presentation today, and the subsequent presentations, is because one of the actions that the meeting undertook in this land acknowledgement minute, which is highlighted there, is to explore a meaningful financial contribution as one form of reparations to the Ho-Chunk Nation. And this is not something we've done some other things around this minute, but this is not something that we've thought about yet. And as I thought about this more and more, I realized that we needed to have a pretty strong educational component to get us all um, with an understanding of why you might want to have reparations, and what the implications of that might be before we really can have a meaningful discussion about it. So the pathway we're going to follow today through this process. Today, this talk is kind of a historical overview of the indigenous people of North America, and specifically looking at their interaction with the American settlers and their descendants, with a very intense focus on the role of Quakers in this. And this is really to try and understand why we actually should be even talking about reparations in the first place. What are we trying to repair? what kind of damage was actually done historically. On April 12th, we'll have another presentation on the what I call the relationship worldview that many, I'd say most indigenous people and other people around the world have had for millennia. And to contrast this with the what I like to refer to as the dominance worldview that has come to actually, I think, affect all human beings on the planet at this point. Um, the reason for looking at this is one of the things we said in our land acknowledgement minute is that if we're trying to help Indigenous people kind of to assuage our guilt, if you will, that's not a really worthwhile thing to try and do. But if our liberation is tied up with their liberation, that we should work together toward that. And as I have studied this issue quite extensively, what I've come to believe is that the relationship worldview is something that is absolutely essential for those of us who do not share it to really understand and I think to take on. So we'll talk about that in the next presentation. And then at the end of April, we will have a third gathering forum where we'll do some worship sharing on possible ways we can think about reparation and engage mutually with the Ho-Chunk Nation and potentially other indigenous people. I'm hoping to produce some written material between now and then on reparations and what other groups have done with respect to this for us to consider. The framework we're going to use for thinking about Native American history is one that's used by both indigenous and non-indigenous historians in thinking about Native Americans. And they divide the history into these different eras, starting with the pre-colonial era, the time before the first colonizers, the Spanish, arrived around the year 1500. Um, this is a very long period of time. We really don't know how long people have been here. The latest evidence suggests at least 25 or 30,000 years, and perhaps much longer than that. In Wisconsin, the oldest archaeological sites are at least 12,000 years ago. So very long period of time up until about 1500. And then we have the colonial era, the period where Europeans began settling the continent from England, France, Spain, of course, the Netherlands, and a few other places. This continued up until formally about 1830, which was after the American Revolution and the um, War of 1812. And by the time the US government kind of got its act together and decided to really change the approach that they took to Native Americans from what had been done during the colonial era. And that started the removal era, specifically about 1830, when federal law was passed with the objective of literally physically removing as many of the indigenous people as possible from east of the Mississippi River to smaller reservations to the west of the Mississippi River. And this was done by violent means, by means of pretty deceptive treaties, other means of getting people off their land. But the whole goal was to free up land for settlement. And then we entered a year about 1870 or so when the goal was not to physically move them. We'd already done that, but now to essentially erase them by re-educating their children, taking them away, putting them in boarding schools, outlawing cultural practices, and things like that. And this went on until the election of Franklin Roosevelt, and specifically in 1934, there was a major act passed in Congress that really totally changed the U.S. government's approach to indigenous people. And a lot of the changes were for the good, not all of them, but this brought a lot of benefits. There was a backlash to this after World War II, what's called the termination era, and that continued until around late 1960s, 1970 or so, when we entered the present era that we're in today, which is referred to as the self-determination era, where the indigenous people really now have a lot more control over their own destiny and are now speaking with an increasingly powerful voice. So, in thinking about kind of prehistory, the pre-colonial era, Um, Native American people would not tend to look at like the archaeological record or anything like that. They're interested in that, but their way of understanding this would be to go to stories that had been passed down orally through their own culture since time immemorial, going back many, many, many generations. And these stories contain not only an understanding of how things happen, but also a great deal of wisdom that we can learn and benefit from today. So I'd like to give you a taste of that by sharing a story from the Ojibwe culture that I have been told. Um, about the Great Flood and the creation of Turtle Island. This is a story that I shared with our first day school students a few months ago, our younger students, and I think they really enjoyed it. I hope you will too. So many years ago, when the Great Spirit created all the beings that inhabit Mother Earth, the human beings were the last of the beings to be created, and they are the most dependent on all of the other beings, the plants and all of the animal beings, for their very survival. And at the beginning, the humans were very grateful for all of the support and the sacrifices that all of the other beings were making for them. But over time, they lost that gratitude and respect for the other beings, and this became more and more of a problem. And eventually, Gitche Manadu, the Great Spirit, became very concerned that this was not going to work, to have the human beings not respecting the other beings. Um, and so the Great Spirit gave them a long time to try and mend their ways, but just didn't happen. And so finally, the Great Spirit reluctantly decided that we needed a fresh start. And so the decision was made to flood the world, knowing that this would cause a great deal of pain for all of the beings, but it was the only way to kind of reset the story, if you will. And so the Great Spirit turned the waters loose, and the whole world became flooded with water. And all of the animals in particular, those that could swim or could fly, began congregating around a giant log that was floating on the water. And one of the beings that was there was a very special being named Nanabuju. Now, Nanabuju is a kind of a figure that exists in many Native American cultures, sometimes referred to as a trickster, sometimes referred to as a cultural hero. Um, Nanabuju was a very powerful spirit, but took the form most of the time of a human being, occasionally as a rabbit, and is sometimes pictured as a human being with rabbit ears or rabbit feet. But was a very powerful spirit and loved all of the animals, including the human beings, and the Ojibwe people, the Anishinaabe people, really respect and love Nanabuju for all of the many things that he taught them in order to survive in the world. Um, but Nanabuju was also a little um, flawed, let us say. He kind of, in my mind, he had the powers of a great god, if you will, and the emotional maturity of an adolescent boy. He would anger quickly and do really stupid things. Some of the Nanabuju stories are hilarious because of the predicaments that this great spirit gets himself into. Um, so anyway, Nanabuju was there at the log with all of the other animals that had managed to make it there, and they were in pretty desperate straits. The ones that were swimming would have to rest periodically on the log, so they would take turns who got to stay on the log. And the same thing with the birds. The birds could fly or swim in the water. Some of them were happy doing that, but the ones that were flying needed to rest sometimes. And so all of them realized very quickly that this was not going to work indefinitely. And Nanabuju said, well, if we can go down to the bottom of the waters and bring back even a tiny, tiny bit of the mud from the bottom of the waters, we will be able to use that to recreate the land, and then all be able to survive. And so what happened was that the animals who were great swimmers and divers came forward and said, I will go down to the bottom and get some mud. And the first to do so was Mung, the loon, known for being a tremendous diver. That's how Mung got its food, the fish that it lives on. And so Mung dove into the water and dove down deeper and deeper and was gone for a very, very long time. But finally popped back up to the surface, just totally out of breath and exhausted, and said, the water is very, very, very deep. And even though I am among the greatest of the divers, I could not reach the bottom. So other creatures began to come forward. One of them was Nagig, the otter. And Nagig said, I will try. And so Nagig dove down, but the same thing happened. Nagig was gone for a very, very long time and finally came back to the surface totally exhausted and said that was just not able to reach the bottom. So all of the animals who were known for being great swimmers and divers gave it a try, uh, but none of them were able to succeed, including Nanabuju, who tried, but Nanabuju even could not reach the bottom. So they were really starting to become scared and think that this was not going to be able to happen. And finally, a very small, still voice spoke up in the background. I'll try. And it was Wagashk, the muskrat. And as soon as the muskrat said, I'll try, all of the other animals began to laugh because muskrat was a small creature and not known for being at all a powerful swimmer, and certainly not a diver. And so the animals laughed, but Nanabushu said, wait, wait. If Wagash the muskrat wants to try, we should let it happen. And so Muskrat dove into the water and was gone for a very, very, very long time. And the other animals began to really despair. They couldn't imagine that Muskrat could survive in the water that long. And finally, one of them spotted a few small bubbles coming up to the surface, and then the body of the muskrat floated up. Muskrat was dead, um, drowned in trying to reach the bottom. And all of the other animals were very, very sad at this, and a great song of mourning arose from all of the animals all at once. And while this was happening, Nanabuju looked at the muskrat's body and noticed that one of his paws was clenched tightly. And so Nanabuju gently opened the paw, and lo and behold, there was a tiny, tiny blob of mud clenched in Muskrat's paw. Muskrat had actually made it all the way to the bottom, but knew that would not be able to come back up to the surface alive, and so clenched this tiny bit of mud and let his dead body float to the surface. So Nanabuju took the little piece of mud and held it up, and all the other animals cheered. They were just astonished that Muskrat had been successful where none of them could be. And at that point, Mikanak, the great snapping turtle, came forward and said, "If you place that little bit of mud and smear it on my back, I think I can hold it up long enough for us to form a great island. But you will all need to dance in a big circle around me for the mud to grow." And so they did put the little blob of mud on Mikanak's back, the snapping turtle's back, and began a great dance and singing in a circle around the turtle. And eventually the four winds joined in the song, and this went on, and the mud began to grow and grow and grow and expand until it became a giant island, what we call North America, but what indigenous people would refer to as Turtle Island. You can see where we are in Madison is right in the middle of it. Um, and so this is the story of how Turtle Island came to be, and it's interesting to compare this to our story of Noah and the Ark, where in that story, Noah, the human, builds the ark and saves all of the animals with it. In this case, the humans are nowhere to be seen. They've at least mostly, presumably, been drowned. But it's the animals that save the world, and it's the least of them that really saves the day, the Wagash, the muskrat. And I've heard multiple versions of this story. One of them, interesting, of an Ojibwe version, that Nana Buju actually, it isn't the humans that caused the Great Flood. It's Nana Buju doing something really stupid to the water spirits, and the water spirits get so angry at him they flood the entire world. There's another story that the Haudenosaunee, the people in upstate New York that we often call the Iroquois, where it's a very, very similar story, but it's a sky woman who falls from the sky, and the animals save her, but need to create land in order for her to live on. But all of them share this same idea of Turtle Island, and it's always the muskrat that saves the day. So it's kind of interesting. So the people who lived in the part of the world that we inhabit were part of a very large group of nations that archaeologists refer to as the Eastern Woodland indigenous cultures. There were many, many different languages spoken, a lot of different cultural aspects to these various tribes and nations, but they did share a pretty common lifestyle. And it was based on the fact that um, this is a very resource rich area that they're living in, the northeastern kind of quarter of North America. Um, but the resources are fairly diffuse, and so you need to be able to move around the landscape over the course of a year to different locations where resources are becoming available at different times of the year. So their dwellings and kind of all their way of life was portable. It wasn't really nomadic. They were going to specific places in different parts of the year, so they'd have kind of an annual cycle typically. And what they were looking for were various things for food, materials, medicines, etc., as well as in some cases sacred sites that they would visit over the course of a year. So they were largely living off hunting and gathering from wild plants, but they also practiced a very sophisticated form of agriculture. The foundation of it was corn, which was introduced into North America almost 15,000 years ago from Mexico and spread really throughout the entire continent. But when corn reached the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois in upstate New York, the Haudenosaunee women, who were the ones who did the agriculture in most of these tribal nations, um, took corn and combined it with beans and squash to form this Three Sisters agricultural system. And this is a rather remarkable system that provides a very, very balanced diet between the beans, corn, and squash. Nutritionally, it's incredibly well balanced. But also, it has the characteristic that the beans use the corn as kind of a bean pole, so they can grow quite profusely. But the beans then provide the corn with nitrogen as a fertilizer. The beans are legumes that have nitrogen fixing bacteria in their roots. And so they're able to allow this to grow without outside fertilization pretty much indefinitely. And the squash is providing, because of its characteristics, growing low to the ground with very large leaves, uh, protects the corn and beans from weeds and from animal predators. So very, very sophisticated agricultural system, and the Ho-Chunk in particular were very adept at this. I've heard that they produce thousands of bushels of corn and other crops just in the Madison area alone. Another really interesting characteristic of the Ho-Chunk and their ancestors and some of the other tribal groups that lived in this part of the world is that they produced quite a few of these earthwork structures that we refer to as mounds. There were, in the Madison area alone, there were over 1,500 mounds that were counted here originally. Many of them have been lost to agriculture and construction, etc. But there were tens of thousands of them in Wisconsin, and so these were very, very common. And these were the peak period of mound building was between about 1,500 years ago and around 500 years ago. So when you see these mounds on the landscape, think that they were built about 1,000 years ago. Um, what you're looking at on the map here is a group of mounds in Governor Nelson State Park, which is on the northwest side of Lake Mendota, near where I live in Middleton. And there are two groups of mounds here. The lower group is kind of an older type called conical mounds. They're sort of like conical hillocks. And they were originally burial sites, but then later were used for a lot of ceremonial purposes. And the upper mound there, the kind of straight line with the blob at the end, is what's called a panther mound, and that's an effigy mound. It's in the shape of an animal or something else quite specific. In this case, it's supposed to represent a panther. My dog Jake and I really love walking through this trail by these mound groups. And so I've seen them many, many times. And what I noticed at some point last summer was that both the Panther Mound and the Conical Mound group are pointing in a very specific direction, and they both appear to be pointing in the same direction. This is more obvious with the conical mounds because they're on kind of a low bluff that the trees block it a little bit now, but in the day it would have had a beautiful view across the lake. And so it appears very, very purposeful where it's pointing. And so I kind of measured the angle using my phone and then went back and did a little research and figured out that maybe they were pointing toward the sunrise on the winter solstice. And a little more research, I found that that was actually a fairly common orientation for mounds built by the ancestors of the Ho Chunk. And it kind of makes sense. The winter solstice is a pretty special time of people who have to live through a winter like we have here in Wisconsin. So I decided to this year to actually check this out. And so Jake and I got up before sunrise on the winter solstice and went out to the mound group and waited for the sunrise. And lo and behold, indeed, the line of mounds is pointing directly at the sunrise on the winter solstice. And I have to say that seeing this and being there at this time gave me a really deep, very moving sense of connection between the earth and the sun and kind of the general cosmos. I just felt a very strange sensation of connection. And that was amplified as I was thinking about it. I realized that the people who built this earthwork to give you this sense of connection were to some extent still there. These was a burial site, and so a lot of the people who built these mounds are lying behind me there. And so my sense of connection was very deepened by that, and it was an incredibly moving experience for me. So, to give you a sense of the Ho Chunk presence in Madison, and our land acknowledgement acknowledges that this was very much Ho Chunk ancestral territory. They've lived here since time immemorial, and just gives you some idea of what the presence was. On the left there is was taken from maps that were generated by an archaeologist named Charles Brown, who was active in the early 1900s. And he mapped all of the mounds and other Native American archaeological sites, not only in the Madison area, but really throughout all of Wisconsin. And just a remarkable body of work. But you can just see this was just a teeming settlement of probably thousands of people. And there were not only mounds, but a wide range of different evidence of campsites, village sites, things that he calls workshops, gardens, places where they were growing corn. And those white lines are the trail system that they use to get around this area, which looks an awful lot like the roads that we we have built over them. They're in kind of the same places. Um, so this clearly was a major center of life for Ho Chunk. They called this area Tejope, which means four lakes in the Ho Chunk language. And on the right there, you see, you've probably seen on television or elsewhere on the last few years, they've been finding Ho Chunk dugout canoes at the bottom of Lake Mendota. And I didn't realize, but when I went looking for a picture online to include in a slideshow, I hadn't realized that they have actually now to date discovered 16 of these so far, and that they range in age from 1,200 years old to probably over 5,000 years old. So it gives you some sense of how long they were here. 5,000 years ago was kind of the birth of civilization in Eurasia, what we consider civilization. And the Ho Chunk were living, right here in great profusion at that time. It's really quite remarkable. So expanding the view outward a little bit to look at the whole state of Wisconsin. This is a map that a lot of you have probably seen. It's actually used in school textbooks in the state. Um, and it kind of indicates that the various nations, indigenous nations of Wisconsin had fixed territories and boundaries. And you can see the Ho Chunk there in kind of the purple color and the Four Lakes region. And so So the Ho-Chunk had this particular territory is what this map would indicate. But what this is actually a map of is it's derived from a treaty that was signed by a whole array of different tribal groups around the Western Great Lakes region. In 1825, it was signed in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, where the Wisconsin River merges with the Mississippi. And the purpose the U.S. government had for doing this treaty was to create fixed boundaries for the territories of the different tribes, so that a few years later they could then negotiate with each tribe and basically take that land away from them, and do that one tribe at a time. And in order to do that, they needed to have fixed territories to negotiate over. What they told the tribes was they were trying to reduce the amount of conflict between them, and that this would help with that. Um, the reality of this was a lot different. First of all, we're looking at 5 to 10,000 years of history here. So people moved around here just like they did everywhere else in the world. The tribes here that were here the longest, at least as far as we know, are in fact the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee. The Menominee tended to be in the northern part of the state, including the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and the Ho-Chunk in the southern part, down into northern Illinois. Also, in the northwest part of the state, you had the Dakota Sioux, um, and other tribes came in later, like the Ojibwe entered the picture sometime around 1500 or so, um, as a result of a migration westward. But it's actually more complicated than that. This is a map from a different website that's put together by a Canadian group. It's called nativeland.ca. It's fascinating to go to. It's basically a map of the world, and you can click on any spot on it, and it will tell you what indigenous nations or tribes claimed that land as part of their history. In other words, they were on that land at one point or another. And you can actually type in an address, and it will pop up a list of the tribal nations that are associated with that particular location. And this is the address of the meeting house site. And you can see that the Ho-Chunk are certainly on the list. The Menominee are not, because they never really traditionally came this far south. But there's a whole bunch of other tribal groups. The Ocheti-Sakowin, for example, the third one on the group, are actually the Dakota or the Sioux more generally. But all these other tribes also claim this area as part of their heritage. And a lot of this was due to various forced migrations, a lot of which happened fairly recently as a result of European settlement. One was the Ojibwe kind of migrating into this area very early on, but a lot of these other ones happened in the 1600s. And both the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee were pretty hospitable people. They were not at all warlike, and they tried to accommodate people that were coming into Wisconsin, especially sort of refugees from various other conflicts, as best they could. But the Ho-Chunk in particular paid kind of a terrible price for that. By the end of the 1600s, the tribal population has been estimated to be down to about 500 people due to disease and some other problems, and just kind of loss of territory. The other thing about this overlap is very much real. I think a lot of you are aware, Native Americans traditionally do not have the concept of ownership of land as property that you can do with what you want. They consider themselves to be part of the community of the land. And although they would use territory, for their purposes, they didn't consider that they owned it, and they would very often work out ways of sharing it with others. And if there were territorial conflicts over use of resources, those would often result in wars, um, just like you have with any kind of other animal species that's territorial. But they did not have a notion of property ownership and clear territorial boundaries like you see on the left. That's something that only came in once the colonial era began in earnest. With that, let's turn our attention to the colonial period. This is when European settlers began to arrive in significant numbers in eastern North America. One of the colonizers was William Penn, who was a nobleman but was also a Quaker and founded the Pennsylvania colony as a place that Quakers could find refuge from the persecution they were experiencing in England. And he founded this colony in 1681. And one of the very first things he did when he arrived in his new colony was in 1683 concluded a treaty with the Native American people that lived there, who were the Lenape, now known as the Delaware. And that treaty was really interesting. It treated the indigenous people as equal partners, very much as fellow human beings with their own rights and interests, and encouraged a great deal of trade between the colonizers in Pennsylvania and the Lenape, and it even paid the Lenape basically rent, compensated them for use of the land in the Pennsylvania colony, and this was really a unique idea. This treaty gave rise to about 50 years of really peaceful relationships with the Lenape, and was quite celebrated at the time. This is a famous painting by Benjamin West of the signing of the treaty, and there's even a stone carving, a bas relief of this in the United States Capitol building. This image shows up again in Edward Hicks' famous painting or paintings of the Peaceable Kingdom. You can see in the right side of the painting there is the same image, basically, of Penn and the Lenape signing their treaty on the banks of the Susquehanna River. Um, Hicks actually painted like over 30 versions of this painting during his lifetime. It sort of became his life work, and it's been used in many instances. We even have a version of it that was painted by our first day school students downstairs in the dining area. Um, so this was really kind of firmly embedded in people's minds as a real model for how one might be able to live with these indigenous people in North America. Another really famous story from this colonial era is illustrated in this picture that was made in 1918 by an Irish Quaker named James Penrose. And this is of an incident that occurred in 1777 during the first years of the Revolutionary War in upstate New York. And what was happening at the time was General Burgoyne, who commanded the British Army in that area, had allied himself with some of the Haudenosaunee, particularly the Mohawk, um, and had basically encouraged them strongly to terrorize the American settlers who were living in the region of upstate New York. And so they were going around burning towns and killing people, taking scalps, etc. And it was a real reign of terror at the time. And so this is a picture of the Quaker meeting in Easton, New York. And when the Mohawk arrived, the members of the meeting were in the meeting house in meeting for worship, and they held their silence while the Mohawk came in, and The Mohawk were deeply impressed by this. They could see no weapons. The door had been left open for them to enter, and these people maintained their silence. And this made such an impression on the Mohawk that, from a contemporary account, they were quoted as saying, "When we saw you sitting with your door open and without weapons of defense, we had no disposition to hurt you. We would have fought for you." The legend is that the Mohawk left a white feather in the roof of the meeting house to indicate to others who might come along that these people were not to be touched. And I had heard this story even when I was a child. It was kind of my first thing I ever heard about Quakers, I think, and I always kind of wondered if it was really true. And so when I did some research on this, I discovered, yeah, there's accounts of this in the both the minutes of this monthly meeting as well as their yearly meeting that they're associated with. And there's even a white feather that's kind of enshrined in the meeting house that they claim is the original white feather. So this apparently really did happen. Quite the event. So the next era that we're going to look at is the removal era. This is started in the early 1830s when the United States was becoming well established as a government, and they had the goal of getting these indigenous people off of the land and freeing up as much land as possible, certainly east of the Mississippi River at that time, um, for settlement from all these arriving settlers from various places in Europe. And the Ho-Chunk, who lived in the area that we live in, were among the first to be targeted for this. The initial treaties that allowed this to happen were signed in 1832. There was a lot of pressure from Henry Dodge and the other lead miners in southwest Wisconsin to get the Ho-Chunk out of here, so that they could take all the land. And starting in 1832, the government began to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk people from Wisconsin. And they initially moved them across the Mississippi River to a place in northeast Iowa. But in subsequent years, over the next couple of decades, they moved them multiple places across Minnesota, South Dakota, and eventually ended up on a pretty small reservation in northeast Nebraska that's still there today. This is where the Nebraska Winnebago, that's another name for the Ho-Chunk, have their reservation. But what's interesting about the Ho-Chunk is many of them never left. They had been living on this land for at least 10,000 years, and they knew how to disappear into the forest and the valleys and in the areas that were sparsely settled at that time. So a lot of them just stayed behind, but even the ones that were removed, very unusually, they kept coming back. They would walk back, they would get in a canoe and go down the Mississippi River and back up again. Whatever it took to get back, they would get back. And they just kept coming, and the government kept removing them over and over and over again. And a lot of the Ho-Chunk who did come back or who stayed acquired land. They bought land just like any other settler, and farmed it and became really part of their local communities. They were very peaceable, friendly people. They always had been, and so they began to be kind of protected by the communities that they were living in. They were part of the community, and so by the time the Civil War ended, there was quite a bit of pressure from the people in Congress from Wisconsin to deal with this situation. But due to some fascinating twists and turns of Reconstruction era politics, and finally in the early 1870s, there was a law passed that made it actually legal for the Ho-Chunk to come back to Wisconsin and buy land, provided they were stayed as law-abiding citizens, law-abiding people here. They were not citizens. They could not vote, but they were allowed to own land. And so even today, the Ho-Chunk of Wisconsin, which were not recognized as a separate tribe until quite recently. Um, they don't have a distinct reservation. They have a bunch of little plots of land that they've gotten by various means, mostly by purchase, as you can see all the little dots scattered all over the place there. Um, and so this is a fascinating story and very much worth studying. This book, Citizens of a Stolen Land by Stephen Kantrowitz, who's a professor at UW-Madison, tells the story of this, and it's just really fascinating. He came to speak to us about a year ago. There's a recording of his talk available on the meeting website, and very worth listening to. It's just a fascinating story of these people. The bottom line of this, though, is the Ho-Chunk were removed, and this was a process that involved a lot of violence. It was forcible, and we have to be honest with ourselves that we're the direct beneficiaries of that removal. As soon as they began removing the Ho-Chunk people from southern Wisconsin, the U.S. government land surveyors came in. This is the original survey map. You can see where the meeting house is, and they're laying out their grid lines so that they could make land grants to settlers in this area. Because this has been such a um, highly populated Ho-Chunk settlement, um, they really did have to clear them out of here for settlers to come in. But that happened pretty quickly, and the plans were made. This is on the right there. You can see James Doty's original plan that he used to sell the idea of building Madison as a city that he had fully intended to become the capital of the territory and later the state of Wisconsin. And that's pretty much what happened. But they absolutely had to get the Ho-Chunk off of the land for that to happen, and they made that happen quite quickly. So over a period of about a 100 years or so, from the end of the colonial period to the end of the 1800s, the Quakers had a pretty strong response to the overall treatment of the indigenous people. Um, i- i- in the mid to late 1700s, after William Penn died, the Pennsylvania colony really became just like every other colony in their rather abhorrent treatment of the native nations and people that lived there. Penn's treaty was kind of disregarded, torn up, and Pennsylvania was no different than any other colony. And by the late 1700s, the Quakers themselves had become this became a real concern, and many meetings formed what they called Indian Affairs committees to try and figure out how they could help the indigenous people as best they could. Um, and as the removal era went on and was finally brought to its completion, and the assimilation era started to take place, a lot of the driver for that was actually a best-selling book by a Quaker named by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson called A Century of Dishonor. It really chronicled the entire treatment of the indigenous people of North America or the United States from the beginning, and just kind of showed how appalling this was, particularly from a Quaker perspective. But a lot of the response to that by that time by Quakers was they really began to buy into the notion of assimilation, that the indigenous people had been removed off to the west by this point in time. This stuff had all happened. They were living in a rather appalling states of poverty because their whole way of life had been disrupted. They'd been removed from the land they'd been living on for generations, and there was a lot to feel compassionate about. But a lot of the response of Quakers of the time was to feel that assimilation was the best answer. And one group that responded to this was there was quite wealthy Quaker in New York City, and a bunch of associates formed a group called the Friends of the Indian, and they really worked very hard and had a lot of influence in developing and promoting the assimilation era policies that the government started to carry out beginning in the 1870s. These included the boarding schools, the whole process of land allotment, Indian offense laws. They made it actually illegal for Native Americans to practice their religion, and to practice a lot of their cultural practices. They also were very much in favor of Indians actually becoming citizens, which they were not at the time. And that didn't actually happen until 1924, but that was also part of the assimilation era process. So part of this assimilation era that the Quakers were most involved in, and I think is the thing when we think about reparations that we really uh, this was not our shining moment. Let's put it that way. um, were the Indian boarding schools, and this started off, I think, as a pretty good thing. In 1819, the Congress passed a law that set aside a pretty substantial amount of money for religious institutions, in particular, to create schools for the indigenous people. And a lot of the indigenous people were all in favor of this. And in 1820, right after this law was passed, the Quakers were asked by the Seneca, one of the Haudenosaunee Confederation in upstate New York, to found a school on their reservation. It was a boarding school, but it was on the reservation itself, and not stealing children away from their families, but just allowing them to focus on learning. And the Seneca wanted to do this. They were realizing that they needed to learn about this new culture. They needed to become fluent in the language, and they needed to ensure that their children could at least protect themselves, if nothing else. And so in 1820, the Quakers founded the school, and they ran it actually through 1938 for 118 years. Um, but starting in the kind of right after the Civil War in the 1870s, the U.S. government began a policy that was very, very different from this, which was taking children away from Indian children away from their families, moving them to boarding schools that might be hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and really forcibly assimilating them into American culture. And because the Quakers had a lot of experience with this and had really to a large extent accepted the idea that assimilation was the best way to address the issues that they were seeing that Native Americans were having. Quakers ran 15 of over 350 boarding schools that the federal government ran during this era. And there were a lot of motives at work behind the assimilation era policy, and a lot of them were really pretty evil, I would say. I think the Quakers who participated in this really had a fair amount of compassion for the Native Americans and their plight. And I want to read this quote because as a modern Quaker, I can relate to what this person is talking about. This was written in 1894 by a woman named Elizabeth Tess, who was a teacher in one of the Quaker boarding schools. I know it will sadly grieve the Kickapoo parents, who were the tribe she was working with, to part with their children, but every day's delay is of great loss to them. There is not one of their whole number who can speak English. In this condition, they are already surrounded by whites and are being defrauded of the little money they have, are tempted continually with strong drink, and are not disciplined to resist temptation. They often yield, and many who are not guilty are arrested and carried off to jail. Their ignorance renders them helpless. So I sense a real compassion here, but it's kind of a patronizing form of compassion that, we know what's best for them, and they really have to learn our way of life and adopt our way of life in order to be successful. Now, I hope that most of you are very familiar with the generational trauma that was created from this boarding school policy. There's been a lot of publicity about this recently in both Canada and the United States. And by 1926, at that point, they had really made this almost universal. An estimated 83% of the Native American children had attended these boarding schools at one point or another. And the motto from Richard Henry Pratt, who created the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, that's shown in that picture below. That's in their early days. This was in Pennsylvania and was kind of the model for all of the other boarding schools. But his motto was "Kill the Indian to save the man," and that's really what the idea was. So the idea was to disrupt all of their family and community connections by taking them away completely. They lost their language. They were punished severely for speaking their own language, practicing anything of their own culture, religion, or tradition. And in many of these schools, I don't know if this was true in Quaker schools, but it was certainly true in many, many of these boarding schools. There were really, really high rates of both physical and sexual abuse of the students. And so this created several generations of Native American people who had been uprooted from their family and community connections, had their language kind of taken away from them. If they retained it at all, they were ashamed to speak it or fearful about speaking it. And so this disrupted the whole chain of transmission of culture. And it's something very much that Native American communities are still very, very much dealing with today. The loss of these indigenous languages has its roots in this boarding school era. Now, not all of these stories of these students were completely horrible. This is a woman named Zitkala Shah, whose English name was Gertrude Bonin. And She was Dakota Sioux from the Yankton, South Dakota reservation, and she actually begged her parents, her community and family, to attend a Quaker school in Indiana. She was not forcibly removed. She really, really wanted to go, and she did extremely well there, and was given an opportunity to attend Earlham College. And then later, it turned out she was a quite gifted musician and attended the New England Conservatory in Boston and began her kind of career as a concert musician. But she was also a very gifted orator and a writer. She was one of the first, if not the first, Native American person to actually write books about what Native American life was really like, and became quite famous for that. After her kind of musical career, she began teaching at the Carlisle Indian School because she really did believe in education, but that really disillusioned her. She had a huge amount of disagreement with the whole system and with Richard Henry Pratt, who was running the school, and got really disgusted about the whole thing, and basically went back to her reservation, married a fellow reservation person, and they moved around a fair amount, but she devoted really the rest of her life to founding some of the very first organizations to promote the cause of American Indians that were actually run by American Indians. The first was the Society of American Indians, and that she was an early participant in, and then later the National Council of American Indians. And that's what she really spent the rest of her life doing. So there were quite a number of other people like this who succeeded in the boarding school system, and really became the foundation, I think, of some of the things that began to happen in the 20th century as the assimilation era was coming to an end. I would say a lot of the attitude toward Native Americans during this assimilation era in the latter part of the 19th and first part of the 20th century is summed up by this painting named American Progress by John Gast that was very, very famous at the time. And it's showing the westward expansion across the country, um, both of kind of technology and settlement. Um, and the native people are seen kind of going off into the darkness, off to the left of the painting, along with the buffalo and the other wildlife. And this was just this inevitability of the American progress across the continent, and the idea of manifest destiny. And this is just a wonderful picture of it, but really kind of horrifying when you think about what was actually being done in this process to the Native American people. And I think the Quakers, although they had compassion, very much like all Americans or most Americans in this era, were caught up in this great idea of American progress, that of us sweeping across the country like this. So this assimilation era began to come to an end in the 1920s. The United States passed a law that allowed, finally made Native Americans voting citizens of the country for the first time, which is kind of astonishing, but that's the way it was. And then when Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1934, one of the things he really wanted to change was really change the way that Native Americans were being treated. And he appointed as head of Indian Affairs this gentleman named John Collier, who was a passionate believer in helping the welfare. And so a lot of kind of Depression era money was poured into helping tribes. The laws around assimilation were removed. The boarding schools were, for the most part, shut down. It took a long time to complete that process. They also did some things that were maybe a little less useful. They promoted kind of a standardized constitution for tribes. It was sort of like a cross between the U.S. Constitution and a kind of a town charter. um, and this was kind of imposing a form of government on Native American nations that they were not really used to. Their form of government was much more similar, I think, to the Quaker meeting than it was to normal democracy, and so this was not a service. And a lot of tribes are now rewriting those constitutions. Um, there was a backlash to this following World War II, what was called the termination era. They weren't like going out and killing people. What they were doing, though, was saying that because all of this had been so successful and that assimilation had been accomplished, and we've got these tribes on their feet, we no longer have to provide the support that was agreed to in the original treaties that took their land away. And so what they're talking about terminating was recognition of federal tribes. And one of the first um, tribes to have its federal recognition terminated were the Menominee in Wisconsin. And they began almost immediately to resist that mightily. And a lot of this was led by Ada Deer, Was very well known. She just died a few years ago. She was a congresswoman from Wisconsin and was appointed by Bill Clinton as the first Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, the first Native American woman to hold that position. She actually, her mother was raised as a Quaker in Pennsylvania and became a nurse and worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs on reservations. Ended up on the Menominee Nation and married a Menominee man. But a lot of Ada Deer's kind of political activism and ferocity came from her mother, who was in fact a Quaker. So now we get to the final era, most recent era of Native American history, and this is what's called the self-determination era. And the beginning of this is really marked by an event that occurred in the late 1960s. People from quite a few tribes um, went out to Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, which had been, of course, a very famous prison, but at that point had been abandoned. And they occupied the island for several years and created quite a bit of publicity. And this eventually, although it was, I don't know exactly what the goal was other than to get a lot of publicity, which was very successful at that. But one of the things that came out of this eventually was something called the American Indian Movement, which was a political movement that was very much modeled after the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and a lot of other kind of political movements, liberation movements that were happening during the late 60s and early 70s. And this gave rise to there were a number of other major political demonstrations. One was the Trail of Broken Treaties that ended up with the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices in Washington being occupied by Native American people. And that induced Richard Nixon to pass a whole series of laws, or Congress to pass and Richard Nixon to sign, a whole series of laws that dramatically changed the way the government related to indigenous people and their governments, and really opened an era of true self-determination. The tribes began to take real control of their governance, their economics, and reassert the rights that were given to them in their treaties through the legal system. And at the beginning anyway, and it still largely continues to this day, the courts have been really siding with the Native American people on many of the cases that they have brought. Not all of them, of course, but quite a few. And so this has been a real turnaround. And it's not to say that there aren't a huge number of problems on reservations and with the large number of Native Americans that were induced during the termination era to move to cities. Instead of trying to turn them into farmers, they decided to try and turn them into laborers in factories. And so a lot of them ended up living in cities like Minneapolis and Milwaukee and Denver and et cetera. Um, so um, so that's this here. This mural, by the way, is kind of showing some of the ways of thinking in the self-determination era. This is in San Francisco State University, and it was painted by some artists from the Ohlone tribe, which is one of the tribes that was in the San Francisco Bay Area originally. So I'd say in the self-determination era, there has been a rather remarkable turnaround in the attitude of Native American people, and it's symbolized very well by this particular painting by Charles Hilliard, who's actually an Ojibwe from northern Wisconsin. Um, and it was commissioned by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which is a native-run organization that seeks to um, have Indian land come back to Indians, basically. It's called, what's called the land back movement. And this is, as you can see, very much a reversal of John Gass's American Progress painting. The woman in the middle there, who's obviously native, is a kind of a representation of a white buffalo calf woman, who's a major story figure for the Plains Indian tribes. But you can see that the Indians are coming back, the buffalo are coming back, the bears and the forests are coming back, and they're pushing. Now the darkness is on the right side of the painting with all the horrible industrial pollution. And instead of laying down the telegraph wires, she's pulling them back up again and pushing things back to the way they were. And so this idea of kind of reversing manifest destiny is it's very, very much in the air these days, and in my opinion, a good thing. So in this era, kind of the stance of Quakers, has also changed quite a bit. One of the leaders in this has been a woman from the Boulder, Colorado Friends meeting named Paula Palmer, who's taken this on, originally kind of raising consciousness about the boarding schools starting about 15 years ago. She has since gone on and allied with a lot of other people, including indigenous people, um, to form a group that's now part of Quaker or Friends peace teams, that's called Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples. And she's written widely in the Friends Journal, and um, she now co-chairs this Friends Peace Teams group with Geraldine Decateau, who's a lawyer from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe in North Dakota. Um, and you can see some queries that she created around the boarding schools, and how we can begin to think about this. And this is what we'll begin to turn our attention to as we think about reparations moving forward. Um, One of the things that this Friends Peace Team group does is a kind of a webinar workshop, called Roots of Injustice, Seeds of Change Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples. This is also a view of history, of what happened, kind of what we've talked about today. But it's a story that is told mostly by indigenous people in this workshop. And I have taken this, and several other people in the meeting have as well, in the Madison meeting. And I have to say that even though this is a very familiar story to me, I certainly know a lot of the facts about it, that this workshop was emotionally extremely powerful for me. I found it deeply, deeply moving, and I would highly recommend it to all of you. It's about a 2-hour workshop. The next one of these, I think, is in early May, but they hold this every several months. They make it available online, and you can register and see some of the other events. They do some other workshops and other types of activities by going to their website. The link is shown there. So I'd like to close by leaving you a few book recommendations, things that I've read over the last several years that I found to be really valuable. We've only really, really scratched the surface in this talk, and there's a lot to learn about the history of Native Americans and their interaction with the United States. Um, these 4 books, I think, are a great starting point. The first one on the left, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, was one of the first. It was published think about 15 years ago. It's a really good read. It's very compelling. It's quite disturbing. Um, it 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 really gets across how violent this really was, and it's a little bit, I would say, kind of left-wing politically oriented for my tastes in terms of history, but it's a very, very well done, well-researched book, um, and absolutely worth reading, particularly if you're not familiar with any of this at all. Ned Blackhawk's book, The Rediscovery of America, won the National Book Award when it was published just a couple of years ago. This is a much more formal, comprehensive history. He's a Cherokee professor, I believe, at Yale. And if you want a real deep history of the events of Native America, this is a great reference book. It's not the kind of book you read cover to cover typically, but I keep going back to it over and over again when I want to get the full facts about something. A really good book that just was published at the end of toward the end of last year is Native Nations by Kathleen Duvall. She is not indigenous. She's a professor, I think, at University of North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. This won the Pulitzer Prize in history last year, and it's looking back from the pre-colonial through the colonial era, through the lens of about half a dozen different tribes from different parts of the country, and telling their whole story through the present day. And it's really, really excellent, and a lot of eye-opening things, and it gives you a sense of the scope. We have focused in this talk today on the things I'm familiar with, the Ojibwe, of course, specifically, and the Ho-Chunk and the other tribes in Wisconsin. But this one gives you a broader perspective, but a sense of how diverse the Native nations really were. And then finally, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. He's actually a Leech Laker, Ojibwe from the Leech Lake Reservation was where he was raised. He's an amazing, amazing storyteller. And this is looking at the era starting at the Battle of Wounded Knee in, I think it was 1892 or 93. That kind of marks the end of the final end of the removal era, um, and the complete military defeat of the Native Americans. But it's looking through the modern era, through the self-determination era, but it's through a series of real specific stories about real people. And it's just a very, very compelling read, and gives you a good sense, especially the more modern history. I'll put up on make available a list of these books because they're all highly, highly recommended. If you only read one book about this, this is the one I would recommend. It's called Becoming Kin by a woman named Patty Kraywek, who is an Ojibwe who lives in Canada near Niagara Falls. She's kind of a mixed Ojibwe and German Ukrainian descent. Um, but this covers really everything that we're talking about throughout this entire discussion, both the history. Her notion is that we need to unforget the history of this, and that's part of what I'm trying to help us do today. But then we also really need to reimagine how Indigenous people, and particularly their relationship worldview and their values, could inform all of us collectively who live in this place today, so that we can come together and thrive going forward. We had a book study group on this last year in the meeting, and I think it was fairly successful. It's a fairly short read. It's very compelling. and I think it gives you a very good picture of what we're talking about here. We have at least a couple of copies I know in the library here, but it's a book I would highly, highly recommend to everyone in the meeting if they want to think at all about these particular topics. So, and lastly, I'll close by leaving you with a couple of queries to ponder. One is, as you reconsider the history that you have been taught, both prior to coming here and maybe some of the things you learned here today, um, but where do you see the influences from indigenous people in history? And where are their stories present and where are they actually absent? Um, this is a query from the book I just mentioned, Becoming Kin. And I think it's a really important thing to think about when you're considering the history here. Where are their influences? Where does it show up, and where does it not show up? Where maybe it should be. The second thing is query is what are the positive and negative lessons we can draw from the relationships and interactions that friends specifically have had with Native Americans. And I think as we consider the possibility of reparations or how we really should respond to what we're learning here, um, what lessons can we draw from history? That's the real reason we study it. Um, so I leave these with you to think about, and thank you for your attention, and hope that we will continue this discussion going forward.